super excited to have not only our class, but also people from around the university coming to listen. And I'm also very pleased to introduce Jesse Nippert, who works for the Division of Biology and runs all the research that's going on, or runs a project that manages all the research on the Konza Prairie. So with that brief introduction, here's Jesse.
All right. I appreciate being invited to speak to you all today. This is especially unique for me because once upon a time I actually took this secondary major. My undergraduate degree was from K-State, and I was digging around in my filing cabinet and I even found my report, Environmental History of the Cheney Reservoir Watershed. And I heard that this year you guys are working on like the Marion Lake watershed. So apparently there's a theme that lasts through the decades about working on watersheds in the state of Kansas. Anyway, so I'm happy to be back. I'm happy to be speaking to you. And I'm especially excited because of the reason that I once participated in this capstone course. So I've been here faculty member in biology since 2007. I've really enjoyed my connections to Kansas State University over the years. This has been a really great place to sort of spend my career. So, you know, it's one of those things where certain experiences have lasting impacts on you, and I can say with all certainty my time in the NRES program or NRES secondary major was one of those memorable experiences that I'm quite fortunate to have had. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the forecast responses and impacts of climate change in the major biome that we have here in northeastern Kansas, and that's the Tallgrass Prairie. A lot of my research and the research from the graduate students in my lab takes place on the Konza Prairie outside of town, and a lot of the work we do is in the context of trying to understand what's going to happen as basically global change factors impact the dynamics of ecosystems. So, getting started, just as a little refresher, grasslands are one of the world's major biomes. We don't often give them as much attention as forests and rainforests and the coastal and marine biomes, but grasslands comprise somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of our terrestrial ecosphere. And they play super significant roles in carbon cycling, water cycling, and overall nutrient cycling. They also harbor tremendous biodiversity and play major roles both in terms of thinking about changes in species richness, ecosystem function, and then global patterns of changes, like I said, in the hydrological as well as carbon cycle and nutrient cycles. A little bit more locally, grasslands are also one of the major biomes of our continent. The Central Great Plains is one of the great grassland ecoregions of the world, second only in area to the Serengeti in East Africa. And so the Great Plains ecoregion is one of the major dominant ecosystems that exists on our continent, and it's played a huge role in the development and the growth of our nation. When we think about grasslands, typically we think about them as a definition of sort of being comprised of grass species as well as forbs. Forbs tend to be another name for a forb. It would be like wildflowers, or sometimes we call them weeds. But herbaceous plants tend to dominate. Grasslands are also unique because generally they tend to allocate more of their biomass below ground than they allocate above ground. This is one of the unique aspects of grassland ecosystem. In North America, and this is something that has happened throughout the world, but it's especially relevant in North America, our grassland regions have been a major zone of exploitation. That exploitation has come from the unique relationship that grasslands have with commercial agriculture. You'll notice on this extent of the Central Great Plains, we can think about the historic grassland types that we have in North America as being comprised of the tallgrass prairie in the east, the mixed grass prairie in the central, and the short grass steppe in the western portion of this region. This also corresponds with the region of our continent that's been responsible for feeding us as a developing nation. So whether we're talking about changes in utilization of the landscape for winter wheat, whether we're talking about utilization of the landscape for corn, or whether we're talking about utilization of the landscape for beef, the central theme is that our grassland region is an important agricultural zone of our continent that's played a very tremendous role in basically growing our nation and feeding our nation. The consequence of that, though, is we've lost most of our historic grassland regions, especially the tallgrass prairies in the east, which were some of the most fertile soils and had some of the highest amounts of irrigated or receive the highest amounts of rainfall over any kind of given year. This last figure on the far right shows the historic range of tallgrass prairie in light green, and the dark green area are the tallgrass prairie that remains. You'll notice that there's sort of a clump there in the middle of that dark green, and that's the Flint Hills. Those of us who live here in eastern Kansas, we're quite fortunate to basically live in one of the last remaining large tracts of tallgrass prairie that exist within this easternmost portion of the grassland biome. So in the northern part of the Flint Hills ecoregion is the Konza Prairie Biological Station, roughly 10 miles south of Manhattan here. Konza Prairie was established in the early 1970s, and one of the things that's unique about it is it's a large landscape scale experimental manipulation of fire and grazing to understand the drivers that influence the dynamics of this once great ecosystem. And so we're quite fortunate to have this in our backyard, and at K-State, this is one of our truly unique things, that makes K-State great, is having the ability to have such a tremendous biological station just outside of town. One of the other things that's unique about the Konza Prairie is we're part of a long-term network of sites that was set up to investigate changes in ecosystem dynamics. So starting in 1980, the United States National Science Foundation set up a program called the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And they started with the incorporation of 6 sites that span different biomes. And through time, this has grown. I think we're currently at 26 sites that span not only the different biome types in North America. Luquillo exists in Puerto Rico for a tropical rainforest site. There's 2 Antarctic sites. We have 4 in the Arctic. Moorea Coral Reef is down there by French Polynesia, down there in the South Pacific. And so each of these sites is basically charged with the collection of long-term data. The National Science Foundation's vision when they set this up was if we can collect data on a range of ecological properties through a long period of time, we're going to be able to detect changes that we wouldn't be able to detect with short-term experiments by themselves. So they had this vision of trying to understand the dynamics of different ecosystems through long periods of time. And at the Konza Prairie now, we're coming in on nearly 40 years of long-term data on both the pattern and the process that drive the dynamics of this ecosystem. There's no other grassland site in North America that even rivals that. There are very few forested sites. Only a few long-term USFS research sites have data sets that span basically longer than this. So this is a very unique aspect of the Konza Prairie, is this long-term record of the climate, of hydrological events, of changes in productivity and species richness of populations that exist on site, aspects of organic matter and the recycling of nutrients in the soil, etc. So within this platform, the Konza Prairie exists. It's a little over 8,000 acres, as I mentioned. And one of the most unique aspects is as it was set up to be an experimental landscape. So a lot of you are probably familiar with hiking on the nature trails up here in the very northeastern corner. You can go on a few hikes of different lengths, starting up there from the nature trail headquarters. But the vast majority of the site exists to the south of that, and it's divided into watersheds. Not in a pure watershed context like if you were a hydrologist, but sort of in watershed context in terms of thinking about landscape features. By doing this, though, and having large units of the landscape that have been prescribed different fire frequencies and different grazing regimes, through time, we can look at the role of these 2 very important drivers of what's happening on the landscape in terms of changes in fire frequency and changes in the role of large grazers. The far easternmost portion of the site, detailed there with that red shading, we maintain cow-calf pairs and early intensive stocking, working with investigators from the Animal Science and Industry Department here at Kansas State University. The idea there is we have a mosaic of fire frequencies with a roughly 3-year burn window. It's called a patch burn rotational grazing strategy. So we can work with Animal Science and Industry to look at changes in cattle fitness, but at the same time look at what the conservation benefits are on the landscape from this rotational burning and grazing strategy. The central portion of the site detailed here is that green shading. We have a captive bison herd that, based on the time of year, there's anywhere between 300 to 400 animals that exist on the landscape. And the bison are used solely as a treatment. Whether they gain weight or lose weight, whether they, new ones are born or new ones die, they're not managed for weight gain. They're not managed as a commodity. They're managed and used on the landscape as a driver to understand the role of large grazers and grasslands. One of the things that's unique to all grasslands worldwide, at least all of the major grasslands, is that large grazers tend to play a role in the dynamics of this ecosystem. So whether you're talking about zebra and wildebeest in the Serengeti or bison here, large grazers play a very important role in the dynamics of that ecosystem. And that's what we investigate with that captive bison herd that exists on Konza. Another thing that's unique about large grazers on the landscape is they promote diversity of herbaceous plants. We have over 700 species of vascular plants that exist just on our small research site outside of town. That is tremendous species richness. And a lot of that has to do with the topographic heterogeneity that exists on the landscape, the way we manage fire on the landscape, as well as the presence of these large grazers. So these large grazers play a very important role in species richness. Another thing, though, to talk about is we call this system a grassland system. It's not called a birdland, it's not called a fishland, it's not called a microbe land, it's not called a wildflower land, it's called a grassland. And that's because of the overarching and extremely important role that grass species play in determining the dynamics of the processes that happen within this system. In our system, you can think of basically 3 or 4 of our warm season grasses that dominate and dictate what's going to happen at the site. It's big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, and little blue stem. These grasses, although only basically 4 of them, sort of dictate basically the energy flow coming in and out of the system, as well as a lot of the other ecological dynamics. When only a few species play such a large role, a lot of times they're called a dominant species. And the grasses within the Konza Prairie and the Tallgrass Prairie in general really play this unique role of being a dominant species. So one of the things that tends to happen is if you have disturbance events or changes that reduce the dominance of the grasses, that then gives rise to other changes. Other species become more abundant and change on the landscape in concert with changes in the grasses. So how goes the grasses is how goes a lot of the other processes that you see in the system. The one thing I haven't spent any time talking about is fire. You all live in this portion of the state right now, at least while you're students. You're well aware of basically the burn season in the spring when fire management and smoke management becomes an issue. Fire is an integral part of grasslands. Grasslands evolved with fire. Grasses in particularly respond very positively to fire. The use of fire is one of the tools that promotes the success and the growth patterns of grasses in grasslands, at least in wetter grasslands, like more mesic grasslands. Konza Prairie, as I already mentioned, has this unique landscape level design where we burn these discrete portions of the landscape at different intervals. Some are burned every year. When you burn every year for long periods of time, it looks like this. I love this. This is all grass. This is what I love to see. I study grass. I work on grass physiology. This is like a dream come true for me. They don't have all these other species. I can understand the mechanisms by which things are happening, within these grasses that live on the landscape. So frequent fire promotes the dominance of these C4 grasses. But Konza is set up in that mosaic, like I mentioned. We burn at different fire intervals. So here's a picture taken basically about this time of year out on the landscape where you can see multiple watersheds as they're intersecting. And you can see the different basically fire frequencies that exist, from unburned with the cedars encroaching into the landscape to portions of the landscape burned at different seasonal times of the year to those that are burned basically every other year. And as you go out on that landscape at different times of year, you see varying responses of different species greening up and going through different phenological stages as a function of these burn frequencies. So based on the way that Konza is set up, it allows us basically to investigate the interactions of fire and grazing as these two key drivers that impact the overall ecosystem dynamics that happen within Tallgrass Prairie. And then based on those results, we can extrapolate and make predictions not only for the Flint Hills, not only for the Great Plains, but we can look for synergies with other mesic grasslands that exist worldwide, whether we're talking about low-veld savanna that exists in South Africa, whether we're talking about the pampas in South America, whether we're talking about areas of Australian grassland, up on the northern Cape, sort of by Darwin. It allows us to make connections with other fire-prone mesic grassland sites that exist on the planet. So, the one key driver that I haven't talked about is climate. I would guess that most of you are Kansans, or at least a lot of you are Kansans, and having spent a lot of time in this state, you know that we get very different climate histories from year to year to year. It's a byproduct of the intercontinental location with which Kansas is in the broader context of North America. And so this intercontinental location results in climatic variability. A lot of the relationship that we know about how grasslands respond to climate and the interannual climate variability that exists within this portion of the landscape was described by John Weaver. He's this guy up here in the top left-hand corner. John Weaver was a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for a large portion of the 20th century, and he really is one of the fathers of grassland science for our understanding of the processes that happen within. Weaver often used to refer to the master hand of climate, meaning that this was the driver that dictates the response of grassland ecosystems. A lot of Weaver's work, at least his seminal work, took place in the great droughts of the last centuries, there during the 1930s. And one of the byproducts of that, his experience of working through the great droughts, is he downplayed the role of fire. The role of grazing really wasn't that well known at that point in time. Because cattle weren't nearly as abundant on the landscape as they are now, and the bison populations were basically at an all-time low. So he really ascribed a lot of emphasis to the role of climate. Another characteristic that Weaver did, he and his students would go out, and he's responsible for doing these, or his students are responsible for excavating portions of the landscape and doing these very detailed drawings of the below-ground parts of the different species that exist in grassland. They did these maps in Nebraska, in western Kansas, in Iowa, here in eastern Kansas, all throughout the Great Plains. They did these maps of the rooting structure. And a byproduct of that is he ascribed function to the presence of roots at different depths. And so he made predictions about how different species would respond to drought based almost exclusively on these diagrams of the below-ground architecture that exists for different species that exist in the Great Plains. So a lot of our current ideas about the functional role, the actual physiological role that deep roots play for a lot of these species has its roots in these drawings that basically were done by Weaver. So I'll get on a soapbox for a little bit, but this was actually never tested for a long period of time. When I was a PhD student, my entire dissertation was basically focused on, well, do these deep roots actually use water from deep portions of the soil? And interestingly, it had basically never been tested. And so this is some work from one of my PhD students from a few years ago, but we have lots and lots of documentation of this process now. But it turns out that for the grasses, at least, big bluestem and Indian and the dominant grasses on other continents, we've done this in other locations, it turns out they almost never use that deep soil moisture. So they have roots that go down quite deep, can be almost 2 meters, sometimes in some cases over 2 meters, but they rarely use water from those depths. You can show this using isotopic tracers. So I have big bluestem over here on the right-hand side. You can develop sort of proportional estimates of where water is being used from different soil provenance. This one over here that says surface, that's just the signature of water that comes from the top 10 centimeters. And so for big bluestem in areas that are ungrazed or in areas that are grazed, it shifts. You can see an overwhelming reliance on soil moisture coming from this depth of the soil. And then all other portions of the soil put together can be as low as 10% or in some cases 40%. So this has an overwhelming influence. Soil moisture in those most superficial layers sort of dictates the function of the grasses, Whether we look at woody communities, here this is one of our sumacs that we have on site. Whether we look at our forbs or our wildflowers community, you see mixed responses. The woody species almost always rely on deeper soil moisture here in our system. And then the forbs tend to be advantageous. After it rains, they use shallow soil moisture. After the soil dries, they tend to shift deep. So they're sort of moving around where they're using the soil moisture from. One of the things that though you can do, where we were like, well, they have these deep roots, so why aren't they using deep water? So we could collect long sections of these deep roots and calculate how much water can flow through these roots if you think about the roots as being a pipe. So this is a metric of hydraulic conductivity. So think about like flow basically through a pipe. And this is based on depth in the soil. And you can see these are from individual long roots of the grasses. And you see this exponential decay function. So the deeper you get in the soil, the less likely those roots can actually transport any significant amount of water. So this could come from basically two different ways. They could be changing the shape of these pipes that exist inside the roots, or they could be changing basically the number of pipes. And so if you look at those two diagrams based on a change in shape, or that mean vessel area on the top, or the number of vessels or the number of pipes that exist, you see the same pattern in the number of pipes. And when you look at cross sections of those roots, you see what's happening. They can move quite a bit of water in the most superficial soil layers, but as you get deeper in the soil profile, the number of vessels that transmits waters basically goes down to 1, and they become less functional. So yes, our grasses are deeply rooted, but no, those deep roots are not rescuing the plants during times of drought. They potentially play other roles. All right, that's my soapbox. So back onto our question for today, and that's the role of climate variability on this system. As I've already mentioned, climate plays this very important role in the dynamics of grassland ecosystems, especially here in the wetter portion of the Great Plains. And so we see both intra and interannual variability in the functional response of the system, how much grass biomass is accrued based on changes within a season, that's intra, and then across years, that's inter. So that variability plays an important role. Here's some long-term data going back towards, as I said, the Konza Prairie is quite unique because we have these very long-term records of change that we can link up with climate. One of the things you can see is changes in ANPP is above ground net primary productivity. You can think of that as just above ground biomass produced in any given year. And so whether you're talking about uplands or lowlands, you can see a lot of change up and down in these graphs. That up and down change, that variability is reflecting the changes in rainfall through time. And if you plot rainfall through time or the amount of rainfall to the amount of biomass, you tend to see a linear response. So it's fairly intuitive. More rain is going to lead to more grass biomass, but you have this variability through time. It's a system that's very responsive to changes in rainfall. That's not unique to the Konza Prairie or the Tallgrass Prairie. If you look at that responsiveness or that response to variability in terms of function, it exists at all of these major grassland regions across the world. So grasslands tend to share a lot of similar characteristics in terms of how they respond to changes in climate, and it increases the value of collecting data here locally to collaborate and try and understand this grassland biome on a much larger scale. It's one of the inherent and unique aspects of the long-term data that's collected just outside of town. Okay, so we've been talking about this changes in rainfall variability and how basically change in that pattern tends to drive change in the process that exists locally. So when we tend to think of the hydrological cycle happening on Konza Prairie, rainfall can happen at any time of the year, but roughly 75% of our rainfall comes between roughly April and September. So we get a quarter of our annual amount typically in the colder half of the year. 3/4 of our annual rainfall tends to fall during the warmer portion of the year. Of that rainfall that falls, most of it in the wintertime, it tends to infiltrate and then get utilized by the forbs and the woody species from deeper soil provenances. We tend to lose more precipitation through transpiration via evaporation from dry soil. So plants are doing most of the recycling of the water that comes in. And of that rainfall that comes, when it's distributed over smaller events spaced out through time, we tend to get more infiltration rather than surface runoff. Konza Prairie historically has not had a lot of surface runoff. Most of the rainfall tends to come in events that favor infiltration. When we want to make predictions of the future based on the best data available at hand, I'll go through this over the next several slides, but one of the things is we're a little bit concerned that we're going to be experiencing more of our water being recycled through evaporation rather than through plant recycling of it. And that there's a lot of evidence to suggest also a shift in more surface runoff compared to infiltration, largely as a result of changes in intensity. So as you move towards larger storms that are carrying more water, that are happening in a faster period of time, that change in intensity is likely going to result in more water moving across the landscape rather than infiltrating into the landscape. So where do these predictions come from? Some is through the collection of long-term data. So Professor Hutchinson is not here today, but he was a co-author on a paper from a few years ago that utilized, let's see, I think it's written on here, 23 weather stations distributed across the state of Kansas to look at changes in rainfall trends over the past century. And one of the things that they found by looking at this is this characteristic variability across years in terms of rainfall. But then there's been a slight directional change. So it has been getting wetter over the last century, but not by a lot. Somewhere in the neighborhood of roughly 6 to 8 millimeters per decade. So a small amount of change, but we are seeing a directional trend in terms of increasing rainfall. But more importantly is we're seeing this huge variability across years. So it's one of the hallmarks of this region of the continent, and there's some early data to suggest the amplitude of that variability might be increasing. So this is measured data. This is not a model prediction. This is our long-term weather station data collected across the state. We can, though, use models, and we often use models in our research that are parameterized using collected data to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So based on actual data, so this is, of course, the United States. This is observed changes in very heavy precipitation. So if you take the top 1% of heavy rainfall events for any given year, and then you look for directional trends in terms of how that heavy precipitation is changing, and you look at regions, a lot of times we get classified with Oklahoma and Texas as the Great Plains South. And if you look through the Great Plains into the east, one of the things you'll notice basically is across the decades of the last century towards the present, we're getting more and more anomalous heavy rainfall events through time. And so our portion of this is using measured data, then making predictions for the future. The prediction is we're going to continue to get more of these big deluges that exist on the landscape. Corresponding with that, though, you remember that previous slide that suggests there's only been very slight changes in the total annual amount. So more and more of the rainfall is coming in these large events without a subsequent large increase in the total annual amount of precipitation that's happening. So that would mean that there's fewer storms, but when it does rain, they're going to be big events. This is from the very latest IPC scenario that was released earlier this year, and I just copied the text so that you had it like actually verbatim, but there was a few things that I wanted to highlight. If you're getting the same total amount of storms, but there's fewer storms, than when that rain comes, it comes in heavier, more intense events, the consequence of that is you're going to have longer periods of time with dry soil, because there's fewer total events, and then when it does rain, you're more likely to have runoff across the surface. So one of the predictions that was made for our region of the country just this last summer when these predictions came out is less future soil moisture. One of the things that I found interesting is that the conditions that are predicted are forecast to be unmatched over the last 1,000 years. That's rather scary. This is using data from our region to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So when you think about this, when we does rain, we're going to get more of this. But in those periods of time when it's not flooding, in between rainfall events, you're going to be set up more in terms for drought, because that water, when it did rain, more of it ran across the surface, and then you have longer intervals between the next storm. And with changes in drought, often set up a positive feedback within the climate system that results more with a greater frequency of heat waves. So heat waves and changes in temperature are something I haven't really talked about yet. Temperature and drought tend to go hand in hand, so let's talk about temperature. So this is data that I downloaded from the NOAA National Climate Center and it's called Climate at a Glance, and there's the link to it. You can type in the lat long of any location, and it gives you the long-term temperature anomalies for that location through time. Again, this is measured data. This isn't some model that you can quibble with. This is measured data. One of the things that you'll notice is that there's a tremendous amount of variability in our annual temperatures for any given location. And so that trend through time is around 11.5 degrees C. But you'll see that going back to the 1970, basically, we're having more and more climate anomalies through time trending towards the warm side. So right now, to this point in time, since this data, again, measured data from NOAA, we're looking at roughly, basically, we have a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in climate anomalies for this location in Kansas over just the last 20 years. So these changes in temperature, an easy argument to changes in temperature is that climate variability is a hallmark of this portion of the continent, and you're exactly right. The grassland region and the central Great Plains has always had drought events and flood events. And if you look back, this is again measured data through time, you can classify basically changes in air temperature and rainfall into a drought index. A lot of times it's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. This -2 range corresponds with what they would classify as a moderate drought through time. -4, basically, it would be an extreme event, or extreme drought. So this is an integrated multi-month predictive index. You can see the 1930s, the great droughts of this region, well represented on this graph. But you can also see many moderate droughts through time, also corresponding with many pulse events or flooding events that are anomalously large in the other way. So within our region of the country, drought and the occurrence of drought has always been there, but what we're seeing and what we're predicting is a change in frequencies and in some intensities. One of those predictions came out just a few years ago in the journal Science that was for this portion of the Central Great Plains. Science, of course, being the hallmark publication for all scientists, that in the journal Nature, which comes out of the UK. One of the predictions here was that future drought risk will likely exceed even the driest centuries of the medieval climate anomaly, one of the drier periods basically in the historical records, with future emission scenarios leading to unprecedented drought conditions. Well, that's a bit terrifying. Since this time over the last 4 years, we've also gotten better predictions. This is from this most recent IPC report. This is our southern Great Plains, of which Kansas basically falls in. And this is showing basically a change in the number of days that are exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit based on historical records. So based on the historical records for each location, how many additional days should we expect it to be exceeding basically 100 degrees? Their predictions suggest that by the middle of this century, you could expect anywhere from an increase in roughly 30 days. So imagine an additional month of days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And by the end of the century, in that high emission scenario, potentially 2 months of days over 100 degrees. This is all, of course, freely available data that's, available, online from the IPCC. And so none of this data is proprietary.
So what is the lower scenario and the higher scenario?
Sure. The lower scenario and higher scenario are based on our ability to make meaningful changes that reduce the emissions that are coming out. These are emissions-based predictions. Do we start to curtail CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases in the somewhat near future that reduce the amplitude and trajectory of basically a warming trend? Or do we just stay on the exact same trajectory that we're at now and end up with basically a higher scenario emission rate?
So is this 1.5 degree warming compared to 2, or is that not what that's representing? That's not what this is representing. This map is referring to a change in the number of degree days. Based on those emission scenarios, there are differences in predictions of warming by the middle of the century and the end of the century. The high emission scenario, I believe, for the southern Great Plains, the high emission scenario is an increase in warming of roughly 8 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's from the latest IPC report. Again, all this data is freely available online. So based on these changes in temperatures, based on these changes in precipitation, one of the things that I'm most interested in, because I'm a biologist, is what's going to happen to the ecosystem. And one of the best ways to do this is to start to make predictions about what might happen within our ecosystem. And so as we think about greater variability in rainfall, we already know that it's probably going to impact the growth. So we've got changes in droughts and floods, and we can start to make predictions. We can also make predictions based on what's going to happen with changes in the grass system based on warmer air temperatures. So this combination of changes in rainfall and changes in air temperature, we can start to make predictions about what's going to happen in the tallgrass prairie. The one aspect I haven't talked at all about, basically, there are other aspects of global change. It's not just the climate and climate system. There's changes in carbon dioxide concentration, nutrient deposition or nitrogen deposition that typically comes in a dry form, land use changes. Global change is a much broader umbrella than just climate change, and I've mostly been talking about climate change. So one of the best ways to actually make predictions is to do experiments. And that's one of the things that Konza Prairie is known for, these short-term manipulative experiments to actually simulate climate change predictions and see how the system responds. Maybe the system is robust enough and resilient enough that you can impose droughts, you can impose heat waves, and basically the system can hold on. So you can use your long-term data. You can develop climate change experiments to manipulate rainfall and temperature. You can then do experiments across a variety of locations, Shortgrass Steppe outside of Fort Collins, Colorado, Hayes Experimental Station outside of Hayes, Kansas, here at Konza, and compare gradient responses within an ecosystem. Or you can do experiments that can be manipulated in grasslands around the world. So you can do these experiments and basically see what's going to happen and try and understand some of the changes. So that's one of the unique aspects about grasslands too, is it's a highly manipulated system, or you can manipulate it quite easily, especially compared to systems like forests. The grasslands are very, very compatible with these short-term experimental studies. So if you're going to experiment, though, one of the first things you need to do is make sure that the experiments that you impose match long-term data. So here is a paper that came out roughly a year ago. We have percent change in growing season precipitation on the x-axis, and on the y we have percent change in that above ground biomass produced in a given year. And you can see with the black dots in the middle that the observed change matches the predicted quite well. But when you get to the tails of this distribution, and the blue and the red, when you're moving outside of this range where you've never actually observed it and you're just experimenting it, we're not exactly sure how well that these changes mimic reality, because we've never seen basically those changes occur. So experiments are the only way to start to understand what might happen when you get to extreme wet and when you get to extreme dry, when you start to push outside the zone of what's ever been measured before. So one of the classic long-term studies of the Konza Prairie was this rainfall manipulation plots experiment that existed for nearly 2 decades, where they collected all the rainfall off of these large platforms, stored the water in those black tents, and they had a suspended irrigation system. They basically could alter the pattern of rainfall, and so that they could extend the period of time in between rainfall events to match these climate change predictions that I talked about. So instead of getting lots of small events with somewhat of a frequency based on how precipitation happened in the past, they could mimic these predictions for the future, where you increase the number of dry days in between events, and then when you do irrigate, you throw more water out there at any given time. So you're giving more larger events with longer periods of time in between events. So even when the amount basically of water was exactly the same, the total amount over the growing season year, you see a reduction in that biomass by just altering the pattern. So even though the amount of rainfall over a given year is staying the same, you're seeing a reduction in total biomass. This also holds through time. So these open circles refer to this altered precipitation pattern to match climate change predictions, and the filled circles represent just the ambient, or the control for comparison. Again, they're all receiving the same amount of water, but by altering the pattern of how you apply the rainfall, it's like you're imposing a drought, even though you're giving them the same total amount of rainfall. So that was one of the main outcomes of that RAMP study that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Another study that was set up on Konza that's still running right now is climate extremes. And the idea behind this was what happens when we impose extreme droughts and then we go through a period of recovery and then we impose these extreme droughts for multiple time periods in a row. Like, is there a memory of the system to droughts that have happened in the past? So we have these large shelters. The drought shelters reduce roughly 2/3 of the growing season rainfall. So they're initiating a severe drought. And then we have control shelters for comparison. So we go through these 2 years, we go through this cycle for the treatment shelters such that they're getting a 2-year drought, followed by a 2-year recovery, followed by a 2-year drought, followed by a 2-year recovery, etc. So they can look through these patterns through time. One of the things that they've seen is that change in production is similar to, as you might imagine, you reduce the amount of rainfall, you're going to reduce the amount of above ground biomass production in the system here in the red circles. Then they were both rewatered, they recover for 2 years, they bounce back up and match the control. But interestingly, when they initiated that drought response, the plots that had been droughted 2 years prior had a much lower response than the plots that had just felt drought for the first time. So those plots that had experienced drought in the past responded with an even greater change in the reduction of biomass than those that hadn't experienced it previously. And so we've collected more data since this. I just didn't have the opportunity to plot it up. And we're seeing that trend play out through time. The other thing that's interesting is the dynamics of the community change. This is a rank abundance curves in terms of the abundance of the species in the different plots. The 2 most abundant species at the beginning were big blue stem and then a goldenrod. And then after the drought, had happened, the big blue stem was still the most abundant, but the rank abundance of the goldenrod had declined. So it's decreasing through time. Another effective way to study the consequences of climate change is to have these distributed experiments that exist basically in different ecosystems and in different continents and all over the world. So a few years ago, there was a large experiment set up called DroughtNet, basically where you're given directions of build your shelters exactly like this, implement them exactly like this, collect these response variables, and then you can compare the drought response here on the Konza Prairie to a drought response in Russia, to a drought response in grasslands in South America, to a drought response, in China and other locations. And because you've designed the experiments exactly the same way, it makes it a lot easier to analyze the data and try and understand like a global response of grasslands to changes in climate. So Konza Prairie has these DroughtNet shelters that have been set up for a number of years now as collaborators in this large platform. And here's some of the early responses for the first few years of doing this, whether we're talking about forbs being our herbaceous non-grass like our wildflowers or weeds, our grasses and our total biomass. The drought response for the first few years, for the most part, really didn't differ a whole lot based on our ambient climate history compared to the control shelters. 2018 was a big departure from this though, where while the control shelters had a big reduction in the amount of biomass from the previous year because of the droughts of last summer, the ones that had the drought shelters really saw a big unique event or a big unique response. So one of the things that experiments like this allows you to do is understand some of the dynamics of your site, but most importantly, couch the dynamics of your site within this network of other grassland sites doing the exact same experiment. And that improves basically the power of your ability to interpret what's happening inside in grassland ecosystems. This is response based on just productivity. You can also do this based on morphology. One of my students, Seton Bockel, captures these images on the inside of leaves. This is a cross-section through big blue stem, allows you to see the vascular anatomy that exists. One of the things that Seton wondered was, does exposure to drought actually change how leaves are built? Does it change the arrangement and the form of the leaves they're in? So this is called a violin plot that captures a lot of the statistical deviation within the shape of the plot. So you can see xylem area between the control and the drought as being not really different in 2017. But then in 2018, with that event, basically the grasses build different leaves. The vascular anatomy can change internally based on changes in these climate histories. So these long-term experiments allow you to analyze data in a variety of ways to understand what's happening. So to summarize a lot of the results from these climate change experiments so far, One of the main things to note is that we live in a portion of the country that has a variable climate history. Climate is a key driver of the grassland response, and in addition, this is a portion of the country that has experienced a variable climate through time, and all forecasts suggest that not only will that continue, that variability is likely to increase through time as we sort of move forward. That variability tends to be a very key and unique driver of the overall ecosystem response. The resilience of this system, the ability of basically species to withstand change and then recover back to a pre-stress or a pre-driver implementation tends to be high, especially for the grasslands. Our ecosystem resilience, though, might decline with each subsequent exposure to some of these extreme droughts. So that is going to require a lot more study to basically try and have a better assessment of what might be happening in the future. And then finally, we're quite lucky to have this platform outside of town, the Konza Prairie, because these long-term observations tend to be key to being able to make predictions about what's going to happen in the system. Collecting this data for a long period of time is invaluable for making these predictions about long-term patterns of change. And ultimately, when we think about our system, when we think about the Tallgrass Prairie, the resistance or the ability to absorb change tends to be variable based on the species and some of the more unique aspects. But overall, it's a fairly high resilient system. And then understanding how that resilience might change really is going to be the best proxy for being able to make accurate predictions for the Tallgrass Prairie as an ecosystem, its response in a future climate. So I always like to sort of end, though, with yeah, it's going to be hotter. It's going to be more variable precipitation. So what do we do about it? And the answer is we can do a lot of things about it. Support science. The collection of this long-term data involving students in science is key to making reliable predictions. You can't make good predictions if you don't have good data. So invest in good data collection. Support conservation and restoration initiatives. Work together to find real solutions. We all live on this landscape together. We all might have sort of different ideologies and views about how we want to utilize the landscape, but we can work together to find common goals that work for the largest number of people. And then finally, defend science. You know, defending real science in the classroom is a step in the right direction. The Konza Prairie is a massive site that takes place with the contributions of a huge number of people. Most of the data that I showed you today was from other people's laboratory or other people collected it. So these are a lot of the people that I would like to thank. And then I realize I didn't leave a lot of time for a question, but with the time that remains, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
So for people asking questions, it'd be great if I could give you the mic so that it'll be recorded as part of the record of this presentation. So, does anyone have questions?
Jess, this was amazing. I loved hearing this, and despite working for a few years, I haven't actually ever heard you speak about your work, so I really enjoyed it. My main question is, now that we've lost so much of the Tallgrass Prairie, Tallgrass Prairie, how do we translate the findings from the experiments that we're doing in remaining Tallgrass Prairie to those places that have lost it? And I imagine we're doing experiments there as well. Can you give us a very brief overview of what we're finding there? So how does cutting down the grass and using it for agriculture work?
Well, so there's a couple ways to think about this. So you're exactly right. Roughly 4% of the original Tallgrass Prairie remains. But like grassland restoration is a huge push. Like when you go to the states that lost most of their prairie, Illinois, Iowa, portions of like eastern Nebraska, restoring grasslands is a major endeavor, and it's an enthusiastic endeavor. There are many, many, many individuals and agencies where that's what they do. They're working to recover, abandoned or degraded agricultural lands and looking at basically ways to restore aspects of the landscape. And so while a lot was lost, land is coming back in at this point in time as like I said, fields become abandoned for a variety of reasons. And there is extreme passion for grassland restoration within our portion of the country. Konza is unique in terms of we are on the western fringe of that Tallgrass Prairie ecoregion. The dynamics of our system here probably don't specifically apply to Tallgrass Prairie in eastern Illinois if you go to the eastern portion of that range, because they get a lot more rainfall over there than we do. So there is nuance in terms of interpreting what we do here in Konza to the broader ecoregion of the broader Flint Hills. So one of the things that we tend to do is we are partnered with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy works to basically conserve lands around the world. And one of the things that we can do is partner with other Nature Conservancy lands in these other locations to understand responses to grazing, responses to fire, responses to climate. So we tend to try and be as good of a team player as we can with these other active sites. And then, like I mentioned in the talk, a lot of us, myself included, work in other locations on other continents. So we take the results that we have here and we apply them to questions in grasslands and other locations. I spend a large chunk of the year each year in South Africa trying to understand responses in their mesic grasslands and how similar they are basically to our tallgrass prairie. So through this extrapolation of restoring grassland, extending inference to other locations, and encouraging conservation, we tend to be able to work to try and piece together a more functional and a broadly encompassing response to some of these dynamics.
Bit to the vulnerability or the danger to these grasslands at being when they, as an ecosystem, are sort of parceled out by roads, telephone wires.
Yeah.
I mean, almost
Yeah,
any human impact.
It's hard to envision basically what this ecosystem would have looked like before we had roads and things like that. One of the things that we burn with a variety of frequencies and times of the year, as I mentioned. But imagine what a wildfire 200 years ago would look like compared to a wildfire today. Because most of the time they would have occurred probably on very low humidity days with a lot of wind. And you'll be surprised to find out that like Riley County discourages us from burning on the like windiest, driest days because of the risk of losing the fire. You can also imagine the intensity as that fire would have been moving across the landscape. So that we do the best we can to simulate antecedent conditions, but the fragmentation of the landscape clearly is an impact that we're aware of and we try to account for.
And I guess the fragmentation was a term that I was kind of going for. How does the fragmentation itself of some of these larger plots that we have, how is that detrimental to some of the species on that grassland?
For Konza specifically or more broadly?
Just kind of in general, so that us and
Yeah.
whoever watches this lecture
Yeah.
can really understand that fragmentation is a danger to.
Sure. So parceling out the landscape has a variety of consequences, as you might be aware. One thing I didn't speak about in any capacity is one of the greatest threats to grassland worldwide is woody encroachment. And I didn't even mention that. There's a variety of reasons for and mechanisms driving woody encroachment. By woody encroachment, I mean an increase in the number of woody plants that exist in grasslands. This is happening everywhere. This is evident, especially here in Kansas. You drive to Denver, you're seeing cedar as far away as, Colby, Kansas. There did not used to be cedar out there. You drive to the east and you see oceans of dogwood in what used to be a pasture that wasn't, managed with fire. So woody encroachment is oftentimes associated with a fragmentation of the landscape and a change in some of these drivers, as well as fragmenting the landscape for people to live in. Because when people live in the landscape and these small plots, of course, using fire as a management tool becomes a little bit more difficult because you don't want to risk people's lives and livelihoods by fire getting away. So the more it's fragmented, the more difficult it is to manage, especially with things like fire.
So I went to the Land Institute a couple of weekends ago and learned a lot more about perennials and cover crops and how the cover crops can sequester carbon and can you connect, is there things to be learned from studying perennial plants on a prairie setting that can be integrated with the commercial agriculture that is currently so dominant in what used to be prairie lands?
Well, I'm not an agronomist. I'm very well aware of the Land Institute and a lot of the work they do, and a lot of their work trying to develop perennial polycultures I think is commendable. They're not yet at a phase where basically you can grow enough food to feed a nation. So modern traditional agriculture is still very much a necessity. But the exploration of new and alternative ways, I think, is a commendable thing. But as an agronomist, I sort of, because I'm not an agronomist, I hesitate to make a lot of other suggestions in that regard. But I think that the path forward with regard to managing for agriculture, managing for grasslands, is keeping a variety of options open, keeping communication lines open, learning from one another, and finding sort of a balance amongst multiple approaches.
You'll have to just end it so that students can feel comfortable, but I just wanted to thank you again for
Sure.
a fantastic presentation.
Thanks.